Hello everyone, just Goran here and welcome back to another Planet Zoo real life inspiration video, and today we are looking at the white rhino. We've got quite a few exhibits to get through and they're all pretty big ones, so it's gonna be a long video. Let's get started right away with the first zoo, which is the Zoo of Antwerp. And the first thing that will catch your attention in this enclosure is the wonderful building in the background, which is their stables. Always gotta love the awesome architecture in old city zoos, but the enclosure itself isn't too bad either. It's relatively spacious. There's a large number of trees, which of course do need to be protected by all sorts of rocks and logs to prevent the rhinos from absolutely destroying them. There's a nice bit of enrichment over here, which the rhinos do seem to be enjoying. And yeah, from this side of the enclosure you can get a nice look of the whole thing as a whole. There are also some of these little outcroppings with a glass viewing point, which is especially nice for kids and allows you to get a close look of the mud pool over here, which the rhino does seem to be checking out a little bit, which is really cool. Yeah, some more logs and things strewn about the enclosure. There's also a little gift shop besides it, the rhino shop. Then over here is a gate which keepers can use to bring more heavy equipment into the enclosure, which is of course useful if you want to place enrichment items for a rhino. You're definitely gonna need something more than a wheelbarrow. And then over here is a little separation area, probably between the indoor and outdoor enclosure. And that's it for Antwerp. Next up we have Safaripark Beekse, Bergen, and we're starting off over here at the cheetah enclosure, because in the back of the cheetah enclosure you get your first glimpse of the rhino enclosure of Beekse, which has undergone quite a few improvements over the last years, one of which is this restaurant you can see over here. This was opened last year and it gives you a nice seating area with views of the rhino. From here you will soon also be able to access the stall again. That used to be possible until all of this construction work started, and this is what that looks like. I'm not sure if they're going to change anything about the stall, it doesn't seem that way. But yeah, it's always nice to be able to see the rhino also indoor, because in the colder months they might not be able to go outside. From the stall you also get some views of this over here. This is the separation enclosure, which is really nice and large, which is great because sometimes the male will have to be separated from the females for long periods of time, so it's nice that they also have a decent sized enclosure for that. But it pales in comparison to the actual enclosure, which can be found on the other side of this gate. Here you can see the rhinos being separate but still having some way to interact with each other if they so wish. But yeah, here you can see just how absolutely massive this enclosure is. And there's also a nice education sign, one side about fun rhino facts, one side about protection in zoos, and one side about protection of white rhinos in the wild. It's very interesting because the Beekse Bergen is actually the species coordinator of the breeding program of white rhinos in Europe, so that's a really cool task right there. So what we can see over here on our right actually used to be a enclosure just for the blesbok and the springbok, but in 2022 they actually added all of that space to the existing white rhino habitat, which you can see in the back over there. So they already had a enormous habitat, but now they have an even bigger one. The springbok got their own habitat, while the blesbok are now also roaming along with the rhinos on this entire field. It is super cool, and yeah, it's amazing that they have so much space here to roam. Even through the flamingo habitat you can see more stuff in the back, and I actually set foot into this habitat, which you can see over here. This was on the day that it opened. And yeah, we gotta take a walk around the enclosure with a couple of subscription pass holders. Here in the backstage you can also see this big crate that's actually used to transport rhinos to other zoos. So yeah, just a bunch of really cool stuff. Oh yeah, and last but not least, this enclosure can also be viewed from the boat safari over here. But being the species coordinator, Beekse Bergen has quite a few more rhinos. At the safari resort you can book a stay with a view of some savanna enclosures, and these of course also include white rhinos. So you can enjoy the rhinos, I was going to say from the comfort of your own home, but it's from the comfort of your own holiday home, I guess. And these enclosures are definitely not too shabby either. The main one that we can see over here, the Serengeti enclosure, is absolutely huge and includes rhino, now lechwe, which you can see over there, zebra, giraffe, Watusi cattle, camels, ostriches, just so many cool savanna animals, and they've got so much space to roam. I absolutely love my stay here, and I also went back on one day to get some more footage of these enclosures, but sadly half of the park was flooded and I could only see so much. But I did go here in the backstage one time on a backstage tour and got to see the backstage of this particular field, the Serengeti field. So here you can see what that looks like from the inside. Of course, big space for the giraffes, lots of food storage for all the animals over here, and then over here we've got 4 separate stalls for the rhino, also some poop over there. I don't think that belonged to the rhino, but you can see they've got some logs to like scratch their horns on, and some water trough, and yeah, big bars and gates to contain, well, the force of a freaking rhino. And here you can see the locking mechanism of the gate in action, and it's painted red to make sure that you don't walk into it, they said. So yeah, really cool. We also got to go outside. Here you can see the rhinos walking around, and yeah, this is what that looks like in the morning when they go outside. It's so cool that you get to see all of this stuff from your own little terrace at your bungalow. But yeah, that's pretty much all the video footage I have of this. So here's some more pictures of the Serengeti field, just to give you a little bit more of an impression. Like, you also have a terrace overlooking it from the main restaurant of the hotel. There's this bridge. This is what was flooded when I went back for more video footage. And there is actually a second field, the Mazimara. I don't have any video of this one, so just a couple of pictures to give you an impression. But here the rhino share the habitat with more giraffe, zebra, ostrich, common eland, and zebu. Then there is a third habitat in the safari resort of Beekse. This one is called the Wongo, and it's part of the Safari Hotel that opened relatively recently still. This habitat is a bit smaller than the other ones, but definitely not small by any means. And here the rhinos share the habitat with Watusi cattle, ostrich, zebra, giraffe, and sable antelope. So a really cool mix as well, and a lovely habitat right there. And here you can view the animals from these hotel complexes, which have several rooms inside that you can book. We also just saw a new restaurant that was opened with a view of this enclosure, and yeah, it's just really cool. And they have a very similar backstage building right here. I'm pretty sure that's just a copy paste they used for all of these enclosures, except this one does have a different color. But that's it for the Beekse Bergen. We are going to move on to the next zoo, which is Burgers Zoo. And in Burgers Zoo we have a beautiful savanna habitat. I mean, just look at how outstretched it feels. It's absolutely fantastic. And even though it's such a large habitat, the animals are almost always on the visitor side, and I think that's just clever design in terms of where the water and the feeders are. There's a cool sign over here about protection of rhino, and we go up to go to an elevated bridge where we can view more of the enclosure. This is not just for the rhino, of course. It's a big savanna ecosystem where the rhinos share the space with zebra, waterbuck, Beza oryx, white-bearded wildebeest, and giraffe. As we keep following this little elevated section, we kind of get to the second part of the enclosure. I divide this enclosure into 2 parts. There's this side, and then there's a little forested bit in the middle, and then there's the other side that we could see from that little water section. And yeah, here you just have a great view of all this other stuff. From over here we can look out and see the separation areas where the animals can be separated and led into their backstages. The backstages are kind of stuck to this large building that you can see in the background that houses the ocean, the aquarium of the zoo, and the bush, the tropical house. Over there we could also see that bridge that we were walking on, and we're actually gonna go right up to that building across this beautifully landscaped area, which I'm pretty sure is actually above all of the backstages for these animals, which is just really cool. You wouldn't really think about that stuff while you're walking here. You're just immersed in this awesome landscape. This path leads us to the Safari restaurant, which also has a beautiful terrace overlooking this second part of the savanna habitat, which I always think is just a very smart thing to do. You've got a huge habitat, so you can make a nice big terrace that can fit lots of people, and everyone gets to have great views of the animals. You can see there's also a pelican pond in front, so yeah, just really cool stuff all around right there. Next up we have the Zoo of Dortmund, where we got a bit of a simpler enclosure over here. We're walking up to the Rhino house, which is this octagonal, I want to say, building in the background. We've got some nice donors on the wall right there, and this little outcropping where we can see more of this part of the habitat. We can see there's several separate enclosures over here in case they need to separate the animals. As we go inside of the stalls right here, we've got a little terrarium. I'm not exactly sure what that's for. And then over here we have the indoor stall of the rhino. So it's this kind of octagonal building. Pretty interesting shape, but you do have just your 4 indoor enclosures in there with doors leading out several sides of the enclosure to all the separate little enclosures. You can see there's a little kitchen area over there as well. And as we head back outside, we can see a little area where more heavy equipment can enter the enclosure, and we can see what I consider to be the main enclosure. This one's a lot bigger than the other ones. It's a lot more landscaped and nice looking. Thanks to the foliage in the middle, nice mud pool in the front, which is definitely a pleasure for visitors if you get to see the rhinos playing around in that. But yeah, just a pretty nice enclosure overall. There's also some education over here about rhino conservation. You can see a transport box as well. So pretty nice overall. Then next up we have GaiaZoo, where we are in the savannah area, and over here we have a view of the rhino enclosure. Immediately in the front we can see an area that has kind of been blocked off by all of these tree stumps to give a space where other animals can get away from the rhinos. And yeah, the enclosure itself, it's alright. It's not my favorite enclosure of GaiaZoo, I will say. I guess that's just the nature of rhino enclosures. They're just big mud pools, right? But we do have some red river hog in here. I'm pretty sure that was a temporary thing. They had to move out of their own enclosure to make space for the expansion of the bongo enclosure, and were put here temporarily, but I think they've left the zoo at this point. But yeah, more of the enclosure. You can see they have several mud pools, but in general it's just a big muddy pit. There are some trees, of course, again protected by rocks and logs. There is a separation yard over here. You can see a nice little ball that they can play with. And there is also a view of the indoor exhibit over here. As you can see, they have a large kind of central area and then some separation areas around that. Then next up we have Zoo de Lille. Now Zoo de Lille isn't really that big of a zoo. They don't have a lot of space. Definitely no space for something like elephants, but they did have this rhino enclosure over here, which I thought was pretty nice. It had 2 kind of larger open areas and then a pathway between the two, giving the rhinos plenty of space overall, in my opinion. Still, the rhinos did move out of this zoo recently. They had 2 younger males, and as they became of a mature age, they moved to other zoos to fulfill breeding roles, and it didn't sound like the zoo was planning on getting new rhinos, so this enclosure will probably be turned into something else at some point, but here it is still for you for some rhino inspiration at least. Then next up we have Monde Sauvage, and over here you get a quick peek of the backstage building, the pachyderm house. And here is the rhino enclosure, as much as you can see of it from the walking route. And you can see behind the rhinos over there, there's some warthog running around. So we've already seen some red river hog with the rhino, but warthog are also a good option to combine them with. Now, as we continue walking along the enclosure, we get some more views, and you can see alongside the enclosure is actually a road, a little car path of the car safari of Monde Sauvage. So you can also see the rhino from the car safari. You just don't drive through the enclosure. That will be far too dangerous, of course. But this way you still get to enjoy them in a safari-like setting. And right now we're kind of at an elevated position, but as you keep driving around the enclosure past this little shelter and muddy area over here, you will eventually reach this point where the terrain drops down and the rhinos are actually elevated above you, and you get a really cool view of them. You don't really see it because there's currently no rhinos here, but I can imagine it would look really cool. So yeah, really lovely enclosure here from Monde Sauvage. You can also see over here there's a big gate to let zookeepers in, but I think that's also used to let the hippo, which are right behind us, I think it's to let them from their enclosure into the indoor holding facilities. But yeah, next up we have Allwetterzoo Münster, and we are currently in what's kind of the pachyderm house of the zoo. It has the indoor areas for both the rhino and the elephants, and this is what the indoor area of the rhino looks like. They've got a little sand pit over there on the outside. Lovely building, nicely overgrown. Always like the look of that. But over here is the outdoor enclosure of the rhino. Again, nothing too spectacular, also quite on the small side. You can see the rhinos standing inside there, but of course this is not all that they have. There are several other enclosures here, and there's also this really cool sign about the senses of a rhino. You can kind of look through the eye, and I think it makes your eyesight a lot worse because of course rhinos are they don't have the greatest eyesight. Over here is the second yard where there's a little shelter bit, a bit of enrichment, lovely greenery at the bottom there. That's surprising to see with a rhino walking around eating everything. There's also this sheltered viewing area which gives you a nice overview of this enclosure, which is a lot larger than the other one that we just saw, so already making things quite a bit better. There's also a ramp going down that thing. That's great for accessibility. There's a window over here as well, allowing you to view into the enclosure, if not for it being completely fogged up. This is a really cool sign. It shows you how thick the skin of a rhino is, so it shows you human skin compared to rhino skin right there. That's really, really cool, very kind of eye-opening. And then over here is a view into kind of a third smaller enclosure as well. So they do have quite a bit of space here if you add everything together. Next up, we have the zoo of Osnabrück, and we are running down the side over here because I could tell from the kind of elevated walking area up there that the baby rhino that they had here was kind of sneaking behind the rocks, which is supposed to prevent the rhino from getting up against this glass. And yeah, of course, the little baby could fit between those rocks and get up here. And this is the closest I've ever been to a baby rhino, and it was absolutely adorable. But yeah, that's the viewing area down there. But the main view for this enclosure is up here on this elevated pathway, where you get a lovely view of the several separate enclosures right here that can be opened up to let the animals through. Once again, you can see that this is a shared enclosure with the red river hog right there in the background, which gave some pretty interesting interactions right here. They don't really seem to care too much about each other, but the rhino has definitely pushed them around a little bit, like, I'm the boss here. We can see a nice mud pool in the middle over there, as well as nice patches of foliage, of course protected by rocks and all sorts of other things, but it does create a nice bit of lushness in the enclosure, which otherwise would just be a big sandy pit, which is what most rhino enclosures end up being. So it's nice that they do their best to kind of prevent that at least a little bit. But yeah, this enclosure actually goes on for quite a while, and we're going all the way around it because we are also going to check out the backstage, which you can access by going into this little path over here, giving you another view of this part, but from the other side. So you can also see the elevated path there in the background. But over here we enter a little indoor area for sandcat, which we have to get through to get to the indoor area of the rhino, which is over here. You don't actually get to go inside here or anything. There are some windows into the indoor enclosure, and you can see there's some kind of rubber matting on the floor to prevent the paws of the rhinos from the concrete that's slightly underneath. But yeah, a couple of separate holding areas right there, and that's it for Osnabrück. So we are going to move on to Pairi Daiza, where we again have a lovely enclosure right here. It is a bit of a sand pit, it's quite open and flat, but the shape of the enclosure is quite interesting. They use a lot of interesting materials with the rocks and the logs, and also some foliage sprinkled throughout, which is quite nice. There's some danger sign over here warning you of the hot wire that's probably around those logs. But yeah, once again, we got some warthog in here as well. We also have a train passing by in the background. Yeah, it's just really quite cute. And in the middle there you can see where the backstage will lead the animals out of here. As we keep going along, you also get to see some of the fencing around here. It's quite simple but effective, and the planting just makes it all look so nice. It's just a really lovely enclosure. One more view from this side where it's a little bit more open. You get to see a bit of a dry moat over here, I guess. And then let's also take a look completely from the other side, from the train. And here you can see how the enclosure, how the visitors are protected. So here you can quite clearly see the hot wire going along those logs, and making sure the rhinos don't get too close to all the people. So yeah, really cool enclosure. Here you can also see the gates that go into the backstage. And that's it for Pairi Daiza. So let's move to the zoo of Schwerin, where we have another elevated pathway along the rhino enclosure. Somehow the Germans really like to do this, I guess. But yeah, we can see a lot of similar things we saw in the other enclosures. Some trees protected by some rocks, nicely sloping off, some big tires as enrichment, and some gates separating several enclosures. But here the gate actually goes under the path into this separate enclosure over here, which gotta say, I love how overgrown those rock walls are in the back. But yeah, as we continue going alongside this bridge, we get a peek into the backstage over here. And yeah, it's very similar to stuff that we've seen in other zoos as well. There's also some education over here about, I think, conservation. There's a little throne, which kids really loved to sit on. And over here is a third yard on the other side of the stall, but also connected to the other enclosures. It goes kind of all the way around in a big U, and you're kind of weaving your way between everything. So over here is another little hut with all sorts of education about rhino and rhino conservation as well. And there's a little donation bin. You can put monies in the tube. We can see all sorts of stuff about poaching over here, and as we keep moving along, we get another view of that second yard that we saw from the elevated bridge, where the gate was underneath the path. Yeah, this is what the enclosure looks like, viewing it a little bit further down on the ground as we keep descending this little area. But over here is another hut with another viewing area around it, and this is kind of a fourth, I guess, since we're counting a yard. The rhinos were not out in this one. There were actually some scimitar horned oryx in here, but I do feel like the rhino can be led onto this yard as well. And since we're talking about the animals that they share this space with, there is also African hornbill. Now there is a little bit of a gap in my footage because one of the files got corrupted, but we actually did just pass through a tunnel, and above that tunnel is a connection between this yard, the third yard, and the fourth yard with the scimitar horned oryx. And yeah, we can keep going around the third yard. I love how they use so much wood in here for the barrier, even though it's a freaking rhino. I'm sure it's all safe. And yeah, over here's a little parkour area, a little adventure trail, and then a nice themed bench where you can look at the rhinos behind you. And we also see a small view of the backstage over there. On the left you can see aviary for the hornbills, and there's some food storage, all sorts of stuff. Yeah, really quite neat. Then next up we have Serengeti-park Hodenhagen, where we are once again in a car safari. This is the Southern Africa part of the car safari, where we have Watusi cattle, zebra, ostrich, addax, and white rhino. This is an absolutely huge enclosure. All of the ones here in Serengeti Park are, which is just really, really great for the animals. They have got so much space to roam. There's also a nice pond over here, complete with a waterfall. What more could you ask for? And we can see an addax right there. But that's not what we're here for, of course. We're here for the rhino, which actually free roam. You're driving through the rhino enclosure. I was shitting bricks at this point. Like, I did not expect this. I thought it would be like in Monde Sauvage, where they're in a separate enclosure next to the car safari. But no, apparently they deemed it safe enough. I really wonder how long this will still be a thing. But yeah, that's just really awesome. And you make a quick pit stop there to check out the elephants, but then you're right back in the same enclosure, kind of reaching the end of the car safari here, and you can see that some of the cars in the back had to stop because the rhinos wanted to cross the road. And definitely, you would definitely stop for a rhino. But yeah, here you can see their backstage holding. One of the rhinos was kept separate in there. Now, if you're curious what holds the rhinos in, it's just a cattle crib, just like any other safari habitat. We will see the same thing at Wildlands as well. It's good enough. So yeah, that's it for the car safari, but there is more you can do here. You can also take this kind of adventure tour in a kind of a game drive-like truck, which is completely open and allows you to have even better views of this enclosure and of the rhino, of course, over there. So yeah, super awesome experience here in Serengeti Park, but man, I was definitely terrified of my car. But yeah, next up, Wildlands, we are going to the Serenga Safari, which is a beautiful safari habitat right here. Thanks to the hills in the middle, you can't really see where the enclosure ends, making it look super big. There's also a ride going through it, which we'll check out in a second. But yeah, there's theming all around. There's beautiful decorated paths and themed food shops and just themed stuff in general. I don't think this thing holds a purpose, and you're going all the way around this area. You get views all throughout. Even the toilets have windows into the enclosure, which I don't have footage of, I'm sorry. And of course, we already saw the ride going through here, so let's queue up And the queue is also huge, by the way. They definitely built this for capacity, but it's still really nicely themed, even despite all of that. As we get onto the right, we get, of course, really nice up-close views of all these animals in here. The giraffe, the zebra, there's wildebeest, there's waterbuck. There's so much stuff to see. And as we're driving through this enclosure, you start to notice that the entirety of it is surrounded by these faux rock walls. They really went all out with this one, despite the enclosure being as big as it is. So that's just super amazing. Yeah, here we can see the rhinos just kind of chilling over there at the backstage doors. Here we've already reached the end of the safari ride, so as we walk out, here you can see the cattle grid that's keeping all of the animals out. And yeah, as we continue our walking track, we've got a little elevated point over here where we get a close view of the rhinos, big chilling over there. And from here you can really get a nice overview of the enclosure. Yeah, it's awesome. But if you remember, the rhinos were chilling next to the gate to the backstage, which you can see over here, and you can also actually see the locking mechanism right there. This is a big ass lock, but yeah, if you were to open that gate, that would lead the animals underneath this bridge to a backstage. And that bridge can actually also open up, probably, to let the giraffes through, because they would not be able to fit under. But yeah, across that bridge, we've got a little food court area. Once again, great views of the savanna habitat as you're having a nice meal. Definitely a staple thing to have if you have a large savanna habitat like this, I'm starting to think. And yeah, you can see a little outpost over here, which is the Kifaru Ranger Station. And here's a nice bit of storytelling and theming where the rangers are looking for a band of poachers. And you can see all sorts of stuff about that. There's also a little balcony that gives you, again, a wonderful view of the entire enclosure. The rangers definitely picked a lovely spot to have their outpost, making sure they can track everything in here. Which is also why they put up this camera, and it's a really cool thing. That camera is not just a prop, it is actually a working camera, and you can see the live feed of it in the station over here. So I actually jumped up and waved at the camera, and I could see my hand appearing on the screen. So that's really cool that that's actually completely functional. But yeah, that's it for Wildlands. It's time to move to the final zoo of the video, which is Zoo Erlebniswelt, and we are entering the African Queen, the boat ride of the zoo, because our first view of the rhinos will be from the boat ride right here. It reminded me a little bit of the Zoo of Hanover, which has a similar rock wall in the water section along the boat ride, although I think here the water was a little bit too low. I think maybe the water level had dropped due to the summer, because I feel like more of this rock wall is supposed to be submerged. But yeah, enough about the rock wall in front. The habitat's pretty nice. It's mostly just a big sand pit. I'm not a huge fan of how flat and straight these big rock walls are in the back. They kind of are very obvious when you're viewing it, especially from this angle, but also from up here. Yeah, it doesn't look very real or immersive, in my opinion, but it's still a nice enclosure. It's rather spacious, and they definitely sell this same view many different times. As you're also passing over the boat ride, you get another look at this part of the enclosure. And I especially like this view over here, where they've carved out a nice bit in all of the foliage to give you a very framed, like picturesque picture. There's also this part, which is a nice little sheltered viewing area. I do really like the view from here. The rock wall in the back kind of blends into the terrain a little bit, so it's not as obvious. Yeah, looks quite nice. And then, of course, we've already established that this is a staple for these kinds of habitats. Yeah, we have a food court as well. And you can also see in the back of that rock wall that it does have some holes in it to let the animals from the safari habitat behind the rhino enclosure to also enter the rhino enclosure, but not vice versa. So you could also see some things like zebra, springbok, or sable antelope enter this enclosure over here. But those were all the white rhino enclosures that I've seen. Hope you enjoyed, got some rhino inspiration. Let me know what your favorite habitat was, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye bye!